Welcome back to another Inside Japan podcast, which is sponsored by Jobs in Japan, the best place on the internet to find your next job in Japan. I'm speaking with my friend Dallas, who we used to work together at the International High School here in Tokyo, and he's going to tell us a lot about how to learn Japanese. Hey Dallas, how you doing?
I'm well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I wanted to start off, just a little bit of background between us, that we both worked at an international high school here in Japan for the last 3 years, and I just finished up. And Dallas is one of the most committed teachers I know. Like, he works really hard, but he's also super committed to learning Japanese. And you're always like bringing in, these Japanese books, like actual books in Japanese, as opposed to like learning textbooks and things like that. So tell us a little bit about your language learning journey and like why you care so much about learning Japanese.
Should I start like right from the beginning?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I grew up in a very monocultural, monolingual environment. So coming across anybody that could speak more than just English was pretty rare, and most of the time it was some broken Canadian French, if anything. But I remember from like an early age being really, really impressed when I met somebody that spoke 2 languages or more, because I thought, wow, it's like a superpower. It's like there are people that you can communicate with that I could not, and that's kind of really cool. And I never really jumped into any kind of language learning. Actually, I never had the opportunity to do any language learning. My elementary school didn't offer French until I was too old to take it. Same story in high school. I wasn't able to take French or Spanish or anything like that. And I didn't go to university directly after high school. So I was well into my 20s by the time I decided I wanted to pursue post-secondary education. And when I did, I realized, wow, I'm at university. I can take all these languages. I should do that. And I had been really interested always in Japanese cars and that sort of thing. But at the time, Japanese was not a language that was offered. Chinese, however, was. And people kept telling me, oh, China's going to be a global superpower. Chinese would be a really useful language. You should do that. And I thought, okay, that's what I'll do. So I think I started learning Chinese, it would have been, 22, 23. And I did at the time, and I think still, the university only offered a 1-year intro course. And I did that, and I worked really hard, and most of my classmates were actually heritage Chinese speakers. So they were either had Mandarin speaking family at home, or they were from like Hong Kong or other Cantonese speaking regions. So they spoke Cantonese fluently and therefore had no barrier to read the language. But I worked really, really hard. My teacher loved me, and she eventually asked me, you seem like you want to go further with this. You seem like you want to study more. And I did. And she actually got in contact with a university in Taiwan and arranged for me to go on basically my own summer study abroad program.
Wow.
So I went to Taiwan for 5 or 6 weeks one summer and learned a lot there, made a bunch of friends, and then came back and basically dropped Chinese because there was nowhere to go with it.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting, because I know a lot of people who learned Chinese in school, and what's interesting and different about Japanese in Chinese is that, of course, there's some similarities in the writing structures and stuff, but there are a lot of like Chinese American, Chinese Canadian people who speak Chinese either fluently or natively, and then English as a second language, or the other way around.
Right.
Whereas with Japanese, there are very few people outside of Japan who speak Japanese. So a lot of, I think it's something like there's 120 million or so Japanese people in the country, and then there's like less than 1 million speakers of Japanese outside the country. Compared to, something like English, where there's like 350 million native speakers or whatever, and then there's like 2 billion speakers of the language. So Japanese, I think it does become that really niche kind of language to know, because if you can speak it outside of Japan, it's like, wow, almost nobody does that.
Yeah, for sure. So then, kind of later on, actually, in my last year of university, Japanese finally became an offering. So I thought, well, I've kind of like stuck Chinese on the back burner. There's not really anything I could do with it. Finally is my opportunity. And I took an intro course, and just as an elective in my final year. But to be honest, that was like your typical, we worked through maybe 2/3 of Genki 1. There were like 35 or 40 students in the class. very much rote memorization, take a
Right.
quiz, take a quiz, take a quiz. So I
Right.
didn't get a lot out of it.
Yeah, and to kind of to interrupt you a little bit,
No worries.
what are your thoughts on things like Genki and like the original sort of text that a lot of people get? Because I kind of started my training on Genki 1 as well when I came to Japan because everyone recommended it, and I felt like it kind of hampered my Japanese learning later on because it had this kind of translation memorization style, which
Mm.
doesn't really fit my way of learning.
Yeah. It's hard to say. I have really mixed feelings about like learner-made materials. I think for a beginner, they're kind of a necessary evil,
Hmm.
but I also think they could be a lot better. So I've
Mm.
personally worked my way through Genki 1, Genki 2, and whatever the third one is. It's not called Genki, but it's an
Yeah, it's
integrated approach
integrated approach
to.
to intermediate Japanese. Yeah.
That's it. I've worked my way, I think, through most of that book as well. So I don't know. I kind of feel they're a necessary evil, especially for beginners,
Hmm.
but not necessarily the end all be all of, especially if you want to really acquire a language. I don't think they're the only place you should be looking.
Mm. So how did you get from taking that class to moving to Japan and getting a job here as an international high school teacher?
Yeah. So again, kind of going back to my university days, when I went to school, initially my goal was to actually not even get a degree necessarily, but I wanted to get a TEFL certificate. And
Mm.
there's one specifically in my province that is pretty intensive. It works out to, I can't remember, several hundred class hours, plus a supervised practicum, and there's like casework in the middle, all sorts of things.
Mm. And that's something I
And,
always recommended for people to get actually. Like a lot of people come here use like with the JET program or just to get a job here.
yeah.
And a lot of them don't have any kind of qualifications, but there's a lot more you can do once you have like a TEFL or a TESOL and or a
Right.
CELTA or something like that.
So yeah, the only thing about this program is because it was so intensive and because it was only certain courses were only offered at certain times of the year, it takes 3 years to complete it. It's not
Oh,
like a
wow.
summer course. So I realized quite quickly that one, it wouldn't be very useful by itself, and two, if I'm doing that, I might as well learn more while I'm at it, get an actual degree. So I got my degree in linguistics and did the certificate course at the same time.
Hmm.
So I knew I wanted to teach. I knew I wanted to teach abroad. Originally, I had plans of perhaps going back to Taiwan because I had such a great experience, kind of, I think, in my second year of university or between my
Hmm.
first and second year. And then eventually, kind of my love for certain things, Japan, sort of creeped back in, and the job market in Taiwan was kind of drying up at the time, and the
Mm.
job market in Japan was just kind of doing what it's always done. And I thought, well, maybe this is the better option. And yeah, I'd never even visited Japan when I arrived, so it was sort of a blind experience for me.
Wow. So even with just basic Genki 1 level Japanese, how did you find like being able to get a job here and then
Mm.
starting to work in, especially in like in a Japanese environment, but using English?
Hmm.
How were you able to actually improve your Japanese? Because I know a lot of people think when you come to Japan, of course, you'll have tons of opportunities to speak
Mm.
Japanese. But my experience from teaching here in the first place was that I was expected to speak English at all times in the
Hmm.
schools that I worked in, and I was not really I wouldn't say not permitted, but not encouraged to speak Japanese at all, especially in front of students. They actually
Right,
kind of encouraged me to pretend like I couldn't understand Japanese, so the students would speak to me in English. So
right.
how did you kind of get around that and actually continue your language skills improvement?
I had a very, very similar experience actually, where,
Mm.
as you said, not necessarily outright banned from speaking Japanese, but encouraged almost not to. So yeah, it was pretty overwhelming, and of course, you're just learning to survive in the beginning, right? There's so much going on. You're living in a new environment. Um, so kind of basically in line with all of all of the things work wise and life wise that were going on, I was really just trying to cram as much stuff in my head so I could be as self-sufficient as quickly as possible. That was sort of my goal. I realized very early on that I needed a lot of help with certain things, and I
Hmm.
really didn't have anybody to help me. So
Yeah.
um, self-sufficiency was kind of the initial driver.
Yeah, and I feel like the same kind of thing happened with me was when I needed to move house when I was moving out of the company apartment, and it would save me a lot of money to not live in a company apartment anymore. And there were so many like jargon terms that you only really know when you go through that experience yourself, like shikikin and beikin, and like understanding like how all of the different parts of like renting a place comes into effect. And so that really like made me kind of forced me to grow up a little bit and improve my Japanese a lot. And then I realized like this could have been a really big problem that I have to like either rope a friend into and feel a little bad about, or I can figure it out for myself and do a really good job of it. And then I was able to like save a lot of money, and it actually does make a big financial impact, like having just some things where you can do it by yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess one of the other things I wanted to know about, like apart from just starting out in Japanese, a lot of people know the sort of beginner stuff like Genki, but what happens when you get, because I found myself getting to a bump at that like chukyu level, like the middle level of Japanese, where there aren't as many resources to get from pretty conversational or fluent to much more fluent. So what are some of the resources that you've used to get past that chukyu level bump?
Okay. Yeah. So kind of as you mentioned in your experience, if you go into a bookstore and you look in the learning Japanese section, I mean, there are so many different series that you can get. You can get like Genki, Japanese for busy people, Minna no Nihongo.
Yeah, that was one of the ones I used. Yeah.
On and on. Soul Matome is another one. Like there's tons of series, and most of them, other than kind of the JLPT focused stuff, are beginner textbooks. And then you get into that Chukyu level, as you said. And there's two.
There's two. Okay, what are they?
Well, the integrated approach to intermediate approach to intermediate Japanese, or something. Integrated approach. That's it. That one, and the other one.
That one's the Japan Times one, isn't it? Yes. I think it's made by the same people who make Genki.
Yeah, and then the other one that I've seen and heard things about but never tried is Tobira.
Tobira. Okay, I've heard about it, but I've never tried that one myself either.
It's a little thicker and it's a little more daunting, but apparently pretty good.
Okay.
But other than that, not much.
Okay.
So I think there's kind of a difficult spot, and I think maybe where a lot of people get stuck is turning this, okay, I sit down every night or every second night and I study with a textbook routine, into something a little more, I don't know, everyday, sustainable.
Functional, yeah.
Yeah, so at a certain point, you kind of need to leave the made-for-learner material, put it back on the bookshelf, and start picking up material that's made for native speakers. And that's like really, really daunting and not super easy to do. And if you're still at kind of a lower upper beginner level, probably not possible. But if you're truly at an intermediate level, there's kind of a point where you can sort of leave the learner material by the wayside and pick up some native material. So a lot of people, I know not everybody's into manga, right?
Yeah. But that's one of those stereotypes about people coming to Japan, is that like, everyone's kind of like into anime, video games, or manga or something. And I like video games, but I'm not particularly interested in those kind of things in Japan because they're just not really something I'm into. And so a lot of people kind of suggested like, well, why don't you play some Japanese video games? And I'm like, I don't particularly enjoy those kind of games. I don't want to do that with my time. And I think it is really important to find something you want to do with your time.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you just won't like it. And then you'll learn kind of like not very functional Japanese as well. Like if you're playing video games or watching anime, like a lot of that stuff is completely useless in everyday conversation.
It can be. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think when you say kind of the dirty M word, when you say, manga, people immediately think of things like that were available in the West, like Dragon Ball or Sailor Moon, and they think of that's all of it. But what I like to think of manga as more so is like the biggest, greatest graded reader library in existence. Because the fact of the matter is, if there's something you're interested in, whether it's like, I don't know, bowling, you love bowling, you want to read a story about people who love bowling. Believe it or not, I guarantee you there are probably 3 or 4 long-running manga series about bowling.
Yeah, I think there was one my friend recommended to me, which was called, I think it was called like Ginosaji, like Silver Spoon. And it was about a boy who like dropped out of, he dropped out of high school to be a farmer in Hokkaido. And it's like, it's so it's such a strange story, but it's like
Right.
a lot of the Japanese in there is pretty natural because it's like conversations between
Mm-hmm.
this like high school boy and his new friends. So there's some weird stuff in there that like weird language that I wouldn't really use because I'm not a
Mm-hmm.
farmer, but there's a lot of really useful stuff in there too.
Exactly. So really, it doesn't matter what you're necessarily interested in or what you're into. Basically, if you can think about it, if you can dream it, there's probably a
There's
manga
probably
about it. And even more than that, there's probably several manga that
Hmm.
kind of surround that. So if you're into cars, there's Initial D, there's Wangan Midnight. If you're into I don't know, golf, there's golf mangas. You can read about golf.
Yeah.
I was recently reading one about cycling because I've gotten into cycling this past year, and they're on like issue number 75 or something. And the whole
Wow.
story is just about guys who like cycling, and you can learn more about cycling. So it doesn't have to be manga, it doesn't have to be anime necessarily, but the great part about manga and anime is they're kind of graded already. So you have like
Mhm.
that shonen shoujo level manga that basically all of the kanji already has furigana in it. So if your kanji ability is not so good, you can still read at the level that you can look words that you don't know up.
Hmm.
Um, and you can kind of read in that level for as long as you need to. And even within that shonen shoujo level, there's kind of easier and more difficult things. And as you said, like you can kind of find these what would you call them? Nichijo sort of slice of life manga that
Right,
are
right.
really mundane and not about anything really so exciting, but just people doing their job, however boring that might be.
Yeah.
And you can learn a lot of really natural, easy, everyday sort of vocabulary and grammar structures. And then you can kind of move into something a little more specialized. You know, you could read something maybe more crime drama-esque, and you're going to learn a bunch of judicial system sort of related vocabulary,
Right.
crime
And I think that's
related. And
I think that's really important to actually learn that stuff and pick up on something outside of just normal everyday things so you
Mhm.
can have something to talk about. Because what I find with a lot of people is when they're speaking Japanese, they know how to have like very functional logistical conversations where it's like they
Mhm.
can
It's
say
like
like, oh yeah,
this.
I'll meet you over here, yeah, but they can't have an interesting conversation about something they're passionate about.
Mhm.
And so I really do recommend people to pick up on something they're passionate about. So for me it was coffee. As you know, I'm a coffee nut. You can see all of my coffee stuff behind
Mhm.
me. And I I think I would start to meet people in the coffee industry. And I figured out all of the different kind of like terms of art that you have for something like coffee, like namamame, which is like the green beans before they're roasted, and like baisensuru, which is like the term for like roasting things like coffee
Mhm.
beans. And so learning those terms was really useful for me because then I could actually have cool conversations about coffee and go to like coffee places and talk with them about it in Japanese, which kind of gave me an excuse to practice my Japanese
Mhm.
and also allowed me to make friends, who actually were interested in the same kind of things as opposed to just like Japanese friends who want to learn English or something, and we do
Yeah.
like some kind of language exchange.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So, like, I guess the take-home message is whatever native material you might be trying to use,
Mm,
you have to make sure that outside of the function of it helping you improve your Japanese, it should also function on a level of you're learning something else, reading it or consuming it, or
mhm.
it's just something that's entertaining you. So, you mentioned coffee. Bonsai is something that I've been doing for like the last year and a half, and
Oh
I've read
wow.
like a couple of thick nonfiction books all about bonsai techniques and cultivation. And like these are
Wow.
terms that regular Japanese people don't know. You know, there are tree species and techniques that are not in the vernacular of normal people.
Right.
But I go over to the local bonsai nursery, which is only about a 15-minute bike ride from my home. And the old guy that runs the place, he'll talk to me for like 20-30 minutes about this or that, and it's fine because I know those necessary pieces of vocabulary that I can contribute something to the conversation. Just as you said with coffee, there's sort of like a set of vocabulary that you sort
Mm,
of need
mm.
to speak within a particular sphere. So if you want to learn more about a particular thing and you want to be able to talk to people about that particular thing, you need to kind of consume media in that particular sphere and
Right.
give yourself the basis that you need.
Right.
Yeah.
So, what was one of the habits that really helped you to improve your Japanese quickly? Because I noticed that when we were working together, you would come in with your thick copy of Battle Royale. I've seen the movie. I didn't know it was based on a book.
Yeah.
But you were reading that for a few months and just like it looked quite complicated. And that I think that would probably qualify as something like intensive reading, where you
Mhm.
can't go through it too quickly because there's like a whole bunch of terms in there that would be really difficult.
Yeah.
So aside from like reading really difficult texts, which
Mhm.
I found too difficult for me for my concentration level,
Yeah.
what would be some of the habits that you formed that actually really helps you to improve your Japanese quickly?
So it's funny you mentioned Battle Royale, which
Yeah.
was kind of it was more of an experiment than anything for me.
Mhm.
I was running out of new words in my other sort of immersion streams, so manga and things like that. I wasn't really picking up that much new stuff. So I
Mhm.
really wanted to challenge myself with something that was kind of, I had no business reading. And
Mhm.
I went through and I read it with a highlighter, as you probably saw. And, it helped me basically farm out a whole bunch of vocabulary that I may otherwise have missed. But kind of as far as habits that have helped me really improve, number one is do it every day. There are
Mhm.
no days off. So I have a particular kind of core routine that hasn't changed in 4.5 years, and
Mhm.
that is I study vocabulary every morning before I eat breakfast, and that's like in the past it's been as long as like 30-40 minutes. Now it's probably 10 minutes at max. But I do that on my phone via spaced repetition, Anki. That's sort of one of my routines. Another one is I write kanji every single evening. So I have
Mhm.
notebooks. I think I'm on my third like B5 or B4, A4 notebook that I filled up.
Really?
So
Because that's one of the things I found that was really difficult for me to study, because
mhm,
I don't mind write, I quite enjoy writing,
yeah.
but doing like writing kanji, I was really bad at it, the stroke orders and like making it look pretty. Like
Mhm.
actually I always felt like mine looked like it was written by like a 6-year-old or something. And a lot of people, actually a lot of Japanese people, forget how to write kanji
Mhm.
because they use it on their phones so much.
Yeah.
So I'm curious as to why you wanted to like practice writing it. Like, is there some benefit that you know of
Well,
to writing specifically?
basically, if you can read, that doesn't mean you can write. But if you can
Mm,
write, it kind of by definition means you can read.
right, right. It's like
So,
passive and active. So
yeah,
the
if you're
active
gonna
one means you can do the passive.
right, if you're gonna work on a particular skill, it kind of makes sense to work on one that actually has sort of collateral, not collateral damage, but a collateral
Hmm.
benefit. So,
Mm,
if I spend 10 minutes writing, it's probably going to benefit me, my reading, just as much as if I had just spent 10 minutes reading. So, yeah, for years and years and years, I worked through, you've probably heard of James Haysig's Remembering the Kanji, which is sort of
yeah,
this, you learn kanji in sort of
like pictograms or something, right?
yeah, it's sort of an odd order. It's not at all a frequency order, but you learn it in order of radical, and you learn to recall elements of each character by sort of forming little stories about them. So that's kind of how I started doing it. And now I'm sort of at the point where I've long finished all of that. I still do reviews every day, so I'll sit down and the ones that my phone tells me I need to review, I'll sit down and I'll write them each 3 times. Um, but another thing I've recently, well, not so recently, I guess for the last year, been doing is I keep a daily diary.
Mm,
So it took a long time to find a good one because I'm just not creative enough to think about something to write about myself. But I
mm,
found a diary available on Amazon Japan, and it's called the 5 Year Everyday Diary or something.
okay.
And basically, it's a book with 365 days in it, and there's a little section for whatever year you're working on, then the following year, and the one after that, and the one after that.
Oh, okay. So
So
every
I guess
year
you
you
can
kind
kind
of
of
can see, yeah.
see what's changed in your life over time. But I think it's actually designed for Japanese learners of English because it's bilingual. So
Interesting.
each day will have a question, and it'll have the question in Japanese first, and then kind of a not so great English translation underneath it. But the questions are so simple that yeah, even without the English translations, it would be no problem for most intermediate learners. So it can be
Mm,
something as simple as what was the most delicious thing you ate this week and why? So you
yeah.
write, 3 or 4 sentences about what you ate and why it was delicious and whatever else you wanted to add. And that's a daily habit I've kind of replaced the more intensive kanji study with to sort of
Mm.
maintain and improve my writing and recall ability as
That
well.
sounds super useful. Send me a link to that and I'll put it in the show notes because I would love to pick up something like that because I also do journaling and it's one of those things that language teachers always say you should do. And most people think they're like, oh, I don't want to write a diary. Like that sounds so lame. And we do it with our students and we're like, of course you should do it because it's
Yeah.
like, it's a really good focused practice writing everyday stuff rather than, you know, something that's going to be either labor intensive or like you need to have somebody else to have that conversation with. It's something that's really good. And I've been trying to write a lot more. Like I have a gratitude journal where I write things that I'm thankful for, which really helps to, you know, give me a more positive frame of mind. So yeah, I'd love to see one of those because that sounds like a really useful way to study Japanese.
Yeah, there's literally only one, and I looked forever to find something like that, and I was really, really excited when I finally found one, and it's been kind of a nice daily habit to get into.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't have that many more questions, but the most, look,
Sure.
I guess one of the ones that people will want to know about on this podcast is how do you go about finding a job at an international high school? Because I know a lot of people who they feel like maybe they get stuck in like an ALT or an Eikaiwa role. And I think a lot of people don't realize that you don't have to be like, you don't have to have a teaching license for a lot of international schools. It helps if you do, but there are different ways to get into like a better paying or more exciting, more like frontline teacher kind of job as opposed to an assistant. So what were the things that you did to try and find those kinds of jobs?
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer because it wasn't easy. So even myself, you know, not to say I'm like any more qualified than anybody else teaching English in Japan, but even for somebody that had a kind of an academic focus on language acquisition and teaching and linguistics, I, like most people, had to take kind of a crappy entry level job to get my foot in the door.
Right.
And for me, that was a huge corporate owned chain of preschools. And I didn't want to teach kids. I still don't really like teaching kids. You know, everything I had done up to that point in my education was geared towards adults. So I basically found that not only was everything I learned kind of not applicable to the job, but I wasn't given really any amount of freedom to teach the way I wanted to teach. So I quickly knew that needed to change. But a problem that I ran into, and I'm sure maybe you've run into this as well, is you know, it's not just a Japan thing, but a sort of everywhere thing, that once you've done a particular job, especially if it's been for a significant amount of time, you get typecast. So I wanted to teach senior high school. I wanted to teach, you know, young adults. That's sort of my happy place. I want to, you know, people that I can still mold and form a little bit, but are kind of already small human
Right.
adults, and they have
They have their own
opinions and they have
personalities and stuff.
exactly. Yeah. So I really wanted that sort of senior high university age student. And I found very quickly that I would apply for jobs and, you know, I would maybe apply to like such and such a gakuen.
Right.
And they would email me back and they would say, hey, yeah, you know, you look really great. I know you applied for the senior high position, but we actually have an elementary school that we would prefer you interview for, or we have
Oh,
a
really?
preschool. And it was like this stain on my record that, oh, you've
Yeah.
taught preschool, now that's all you can do. So a difficult challenge for me was sort of having to take my experience sort of prior to that and my experience from that and sort of trying to spin it in a way that I could convince prospective employer that I was the right guy
Right.
for the high school position.
Yeah, and
So
I
that
think
was
that's an important
challenging.
skill to learn as well, like writing your resume as though you're applying for the job you want. Because a lot of people, they write their resume once and they just say what they did, but they don't make it relevant. So like for me, before I got the job at the school we both taught at, I did, in the summer, I picked up a very poorly paying job as a debate coach for a girls' school in Tokyo. And then I got hired on at that school to do a debate class. And it wasn't a particularly, it was a reasonably well-paying job, but it wasn't amazing fun, but I realized like, okay, if I want to teach senior high school, which at the time I was really excited to try and do, I need to get some experience in it. And I had been teaching kindergarten for 5 years at that point. So, you know, it was very difficult for me to explain how my kindergarten experience was useful at a high school, but it really is. Like, that's the thing. It actually is. And you just have to be able to explain that with your resume and with your cover letter, and explain like, you know, how, for me, I think the way I explained it was that basically big kids and little kids, they're all still people. And a lot of the things that you learn from teaching little kids, like how to deal with kids having a tough day, like it's really a lot about having empathy and about being able to put yourself in the kids' shoes, so that then you can actually reach them where they need to be, like understood and felt recognized, you know. And so a lot of that actually did come in with my high school students, and I think I had a really good relationship with a lot of my students, because I would listen to them and I would give them time to kind of say their piece. So so I think that's an important message, right? It's like, don't just apply for a job and say, hey, look at all the things I've done. Like, take all the things you've done and say, this is why this would be useful in this job. This is why this is something that could help me do a better job at the senior high school position that I want, you know?
Right. And you mentioned cover letters. Cover letters are huge. If you are applying, and if you're applying for a lot of positions and you're just copying pasting the same
It's so
generic cover
obvious.
letter,
Yeah.
it's really obvious. It sounds kind of funny, but I think employers, to an extent, they want you to sort of suck up to them a little bit. So they want to see that you've done a little bit of research about their institution, and they don't want you to tell them, you know, what you can gain from them, but what you can provide to their institution, what sort of benefits you can bring to the table. So if you know, find a website, read sort of the About Us page, learn something that's sort of unique about what a school is doing, and then put that in your cover letter and tell them how you can make that even better, that's like huge. So that's something that I've tried to do in the past, and it really helped. Spending a little bit of time and writing a very personal cover letter for that particular position is huge.
That's really interesting, because that was actually how I got the debate class job, because the
Right.
school was kind of famous because they'd had the guy who invented Evernote, which is like a note-taking app. They had him come to the school and explain how they could use it for EdTech, and like because all the students in the school had computers. They all had a laptop that they could work from. And so they used Evernote as kind of like a collaboration tool to, you know, give students homeworks and things like that. Where, you know, I think in our school we were using Google Classroom and things like that, but at the time they were using Evernote. And so I found that on like a news article somewhere. It wasn't like directly on their website, it was on a news article. And so I said, oh, I read about this school, like that you use Evernote in your classrooms, and I'm really interested in how I'm really into technology. I used to be a web developer, so I can think of like so many cool ways of using this technology in a debate class. And they're like, whoa, that's like far and away better than anyone just saying like, oh, I'd like to work at your school because it's famous or something. Yeah. So for people who, especially for people who are learning Japanese, and maybe they get a little bit demoralized by, you know, people saying, wow, Nihongo sugoi or something all the time. Like, what are some ways for them to get past that so that they can really enjoy like learning the language? And then once you do learn the language, you can be really respected by Japanese people, and you stop getting all that, oh, Nihongo my kind of thing. Like,
They go, you know, Nihon ni nannen gurai?
Yeah, right.
That's
They
the
ask you how
question
long
you want.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, I have an analogy actually that works pretty well for that.
Oh yeah.
And it might not work if you were from a subtropical climate, but if you've ever made a snowman, you know, you start with a snowball, and you roll that snowball, say, I don't know, 2 meters, and that snowball in 2 meters triples in size, and you go, wow, look how much this snowball has grown. That's sort of the zero to beginner level. Now you roll that snowball another 2 meters, and it's picked up actually more snow than the first 2 meters, but it doesn't look like it's grown very much. It looks like maybe it's enlarged by 10% or snow, and you push it another 2 meters and the same thing happens. So the farther you get along in your journey, the less perceivable your growth actually is. And that's what makes kind of reaching a higher level of language so difficult, is the leaps and bounds are not so noticeable anymore, not to you anyway. So I guess kind of the take-home message, the best take-home message that I can give, and something I've tried to do for myself, is Set measurable long-term goals for yourself. Things that are sort of carrot on the stick for you. So I know a lot of people don't love the JLPT, but for me, that's one thing I've done is, I've told myself, okay, next year I'm going to take this level of the JLPT and I'm going to pass. And I've done it every time. I haven't studied specifically for that, but it's been something measurable that I can, sit down and look at a piece of paper and say, this says I've improved. That's motivating to me. I'm going to keep going. But it doesn't have to be a test. It could be, I'm going to read this novel by December. I'm going to have a 10-minute conversation entirely in Japanese with somebody. I'm going to do whatever. So set goals, work towards those goals, achieve those goals, be motivated by those goals, and then set a new one. And just keep going.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Awesome. Thank you so much, Dallas. And thank you for talking with us today.